Step 3 in creating a sermon is to create your introduction and your conclusion. So in the first video, we learned about how to find your big idea. In the second video, how to outline your sermon. In this third one, we're going to be talking about how you're going to begin this sermon that you've been working on and how you're going to end it. Now, you might find it a little strange to work at the end of your creative process on the beginning of your sermon, but the fact is you want to be sure you know where you are headed before you create your introduction. Otherwise, you might try to make the rest of the sermon fit with the introduction instead of the introduction serving the sermon. Having said that, by formulating in the first step your big idea and your sermon's purpose, actually, you've already been working on your introduction and conclusion. Now, when I ask myself what makes for a good introduction, there are a few key characteristics that I think are absolutely vital. And let me stress, sermon introductions are more important now than they have ever been. There are so many other things people can be doing with their attention other than listening to your sermon, in spite of the fact that you're in the same room together. When I teach my students how to write an effective sermon introduction, I say it's got to have the following 4 characteristics. First, it needs to be attention-getting. And there's several ways you can do this. You can be attention-getting by making an attention-getting statement. Like today, I'm going to teach you how to backslide. Or an attention-getting question. If God is so good, why does He allow such bad things? Or a startling fact or statistic. In fact, in the example I provided, I've included 2 of those attention-getting introductions. First, I begin with an attention-getting statement, and second, I offer a startling fact or statistic. Now, a warning here. Be sure that your facts and statistics come from a reliable source. When I'm choosing which statistics or facts I'm going to cite, if someone were to come up to me after service and say, "Where did you get that?" could I tell them where I got it from, and was it a reliable source? I should also say that when it comes to attention-getting questions, learn to formulate those questions in a way that people in the audience will recognize those as their questions. In other words, you don't want to get up and say something like, "Which theodicy best justifies God's allowance of evil?" Instead, you want to say, "If God is so good, why does He allow such evil things to happen?" It's important that the questions that you state in the pulpit are pew questions, not preacher questions. Now, once I have got that first element, that first characteristic, attention-getting, I then want to include identifying the need. So all effective sermon introductions are going to be attention-getting, and they're also going to identify the need. Once you've got their attention, why should they continue to listen to you? So very quickly, now that they're listening, you want to explain why what you're talking about is important to them now, will be important to them, or will be important to someone that they love. That last statement is something I found very helpful when I'm concerned that my need or issue being addressed may not be felt by many people in the audience. Perhaps they think, "Oh, I've already dealt with this," or "That's not an issue I have." But if I can help them to see that what I'm going to be talking about will help someone they love, truth is they tend to pay more attention than they would if it was for their own benefit. So again, an effective introduction is attention-getting. It raises the need. It then, listen carefully, previews the outline of the sermon. So for instance, I might begin with this sermon out of Philippians with an attention-getting statement. I say, I've got a confession to make. I'm going to tell you something about myself I'm not very proud of. I'm going to confess a sin that I've struggled with over and over again. Now, chances are you wouldn't find it hard to believe that everybody is listening to what I'm about to confess. And what do I confess? I worry. I'm anxious. I'm too fearful about the future. Well, number one, they're relieved that I didn't, unload too big of a confession on them, or perhaps they're a little disappointed, but they also find that they relate to what I'm talking about. Then I use some startling facts or statistics that describe that most of what it is that we worry about never happens at all. It never occurs in the first place. That most of what we worry about never actually happens. See what I've done there? I've got their attention, and now that I've got it, I'll turn to raising the need. Don't you feel this way sometimes? Aren't there moments that you can't enjoy where you are in the present because you're too worried about the future? Could it be that some of you are having a hard time listening to me right now because even though your body is here, your thoughts are elsewhere? So what am I doing? I'm getting people to feel like, yeah, this is something that I need to know more about. Then I preview the outline. What Paul is going to teach us today is that there is a way to stop worrying, to do something better in its place, and there's a benefit as a result. Or I might go ahead and actually state the point headings when I preview the outline. I might say what we're going to learn to do is not be anxious about anything, pray about everything, and as a result, be blessed by God's peace guarding our hearts and our minds. Now, I imagine some people are concerned that if we give our outline away up front, that perhaps we're giving away too much too soon. But here's a hard truth. Most people who listen to sermons are not bored by sermons because the preacher was too clear. Most people who have a hard time following us are not having a hard time because we gave away too much too soon. It's because they're having a hard time following us. And again, this is a basic way of learning how to develop your sermon. As you grow, you'll find more inductive ways that perhaps do a better job of building tension up front. But right now, our goal is clarity and organization. So an effective sermon introduction is going to be attention-getting. It's going to raise the need, it's going to preview the outline, and then this is really important. It's going to transition to the text. Make your audience want to turn with you to the passage that you're going to be preaching from. Help them to see that this passage is going to provide an answer, guidance, clarity to the problem, the question, the issue that you introduced in the sermon introduction. Now, once you've created your sermon introduction, you'll then want to begin to work on your sermon conclusion. One last thought about a sermon introduction. You can choose to state your big idea. In fact, you might do that right after you've identified the need that you're going to be addressing, or you might do that before you actually go to the reading of the passage. But many people find that by stating the idea right up front in the introduction, it helps the audience to see where they are going. Now, after you've completed your introduction, you'll then work on your conclusion. Now, remember, at this stage in sermon development, we've already written the sermon's purpose in the first step, so we have a pretty good idea of where we need to land. Nevertheless, there are some things you want to be sure characterize your conclusion. And when it comes to writing your sermon conclusion, you have a few options. First, you can recap your ideas. So for instance, if we were using my sermon as an example, we might choose at the end to recap all of these main ideas. Or instead of recapping your ideas in your conclusion, you can anticipate objections. What is it that you know about your audience that would lead them to feel, this is hard to believe, or this is hard to practice, or it's not that it's not true, it's just not true for me. Anticipate those objections and help them to see why they're not good reasons not to obey God's word. Another possibility for conclusions is to apply. Perhaps your sermon has been primarily teaching people things, helping people to understand and explain. Then it's going to be very, very important that in the conclusion you provide some takeaway, some guidance as to how they're supposed to walk this message out. Another option is you can illustrate the application by providing examples of people who are doing what it is that your sermon's calling for. And this is something Sermonary can help you with as well, both for the introduction and conclusion. If you find that you have more illustrations than you had intended to use for your sermon, it may be that those illustrations can be used in your introduction and your conclusion. I should also say a word about the My Ideas feature found in Sermonary. There is a section where you can take ideas that you've been working on, such as your big idea or your central idea, or perhaps a good illustration or a good conclusion, and you can file them away so you can reference them later. The truth is, not every good story or startling statistic that you hear should make it in this Sunday's sermon. But if you can wisely file them away, perhaps under the headings of, say, subject from A to Z or scripture from Genesis to Revelation, then they'll be easy for you to access. Gordon Fee, the great New Testament commentator, once said that a master researcher knows you never want to have to look up something twice. And so when you find an idea that you want to use, put it away in Sermonary's My Idea feature, and it'll be easily accessible for this week's sermon or sermons in the future. A few warnings about conclusions. Don't introduce any new ideas. Now, you can provide some application, but don't bring up something that you haven't talked about before in the sermon. Also, don't announce your conclusion. This is something I really hope you'll take to heart. when you say finally, when you say lastly, when you say in conclusion, people will stop listening before you stop talking. Also, don't take too long with a conclusion. I'm often asked, how long should an introduction conclusion be? Well, on the one hand, the thing I want to say is, how much time do you need in the case of an introduction to be attention-getting, raise a need, preview the outline and transition to the text? Or how much time do you need to help drive home that sermon's purpose? But it is pretty important that you don't take a long time in the conclusion, because when people can sense that you're wrapping up, they're ready for that to happen. And whether that's going to lead to the service being dismissed, singing a hymn, having an invitation to come pray in the front, people are moving psychologically toward a conclusion when they can tell in the sermon you're moving toward a conclusion. So in this step, we've learned about how to create an introduction and conclusion. In the second lesson, we learned how to outline our sermon, and in the first lesson, we learned how to find the big idea. In the last lesson, we're going to learn how to take all of this content to deliver it in a way with passion and conviction.